a quarter of all houses in this country were built over 100 years ago, and most of those with solid walls, etc., no cavities. So it's absolutely crucial that the historic environment plays its part in mitigating climate change, and retrofit is clearly, when we're talking about that number of buildings, and that's just houses, but that number of buildings is a really key part of the answer to that particular problem. So we're absolutely alive to that, the need for the historical environment to play its part. But there are a number of interesting sort of policy and technical challenges that we're working through, and we're really keen to help owners and managers of all kinds of historic sites to find ways to make them more energy efficient, to find ways to use less energy to I suppose prolong the life of those buildings and do that in a really sustainable way. So we provide a lot of technical guidance on our website. How do you go about those sort of the difficult technical challenges of retrofitting a historic building? What are the appropriate ways to do that? Because of course you can't just treat them as though they are like modern constructed buildings, because they perform in different ways. So we provide a lot of technical guidance on that. We do a lot of research on that, and we also do a lot of work to kind of help shape policy, both local and national, to kind of achieve that really important balance between retrofitting and prolonging the life of historic buildings whilst also maintaining their special character. And it is always a balance. You're always sort of weighing up sometimes competing interests to achieve a really positive outcome. The range of historic buildings that we're talking about is vast. I mean, the vast majority of what we've just been talking about are sort of, I suppose, Victorian terraces, that kind of average London housing that so many people live in. And it's really important that we find a solution to assist homeowners with that work. I think the key point here is, first of all, I suppose 2 points. One is that kind of the technical understanding of the right way to do it, and the other is about kind of helping government to put in place policies and incentives to allow homeowners and other building owners and operators to do the works that are required in a sympathetic way. So it's a bit about kind of helping understanding, but also about incentivizing, and we're sort of helping with both of those points. Marks & Spencer's is a really good example of that kind of balance that we have to do in every case between the needs of the building and the performance of the building and the special character of the building, but also of its surroundings. I mean, the decision in the M&S case is particularly related to its surroundings, how it contributes to that kind of character of Oxford Street, as much as it was, I think, about the individual building, which of course isn't listed. But in all of those situations, you're kind of weighing up that significance. How much significance is there, and where does that lie? Is it just in the facade? Is it in its roof form? Is it in its interiors? And you're weighing that up against the various measures that you could put in place to improve the performance of that building. And there are some situations where the kind of the performance of the building is so difficult to improve that might outweigh the sort of special character of the building, but you would still nonetheless try and look for a solution that preserved as much as that as possible. So it's a constant balance, and we are very experienced in making those kinds of decisions, because we're thinking about it all the time across the whole of the country. There are so many things you can do to historic buildings beyond just insulation. I think St Pauls Cathedral behind me is a really good example of that, because you sort of assume St Paul's one of the most important buildings in London. It absolutely is, but there are a number of things that you could do to St Paul's Cathedral to help improve its performance, and that is no doubt something that the cathedral is thinking about. It has, for example, a number of very hidden roofs, and you wonder, there are opportunities there to generate energy in a way that Londoners wouldn't even be aware of. So Historic England has invested over the past 5 years about £100 million in high streets across the country. We've run these sorts of area-based regeneration schemes in the past, but I think what's most interesting about this one, well, two things that are really interesting about this one. One is that it's focused on high streets, and of course in that 5-year period we've had COVID and we've had all kinds of challenges to the high street. But also we recognise more than ever that places are about people as much as the buildings, and our high street programme has been a really interesting example of how do you bring people to the high street for different reasons perhaps than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago, but how do you keep life in those places and make them interesting still? We have invested in 4 high streets in London, from South Norwood to Tottenham High Road, and Woolwich, Harlesden, and that's all been about how do you bring life, how do you bring sort of sustainability, I suppose, to those interesting and sort of much cherished historic places. We're in an interesting moment, aren't we? I think in the sort of post-COVID London, we're sort of thinking about sustainability to a greater extent. That's clearly having an effect on the development world. There's so much more retrofit going on than there has been in the past, and so many of the conversations we're having are about retrofitting buildings rather than replacing them. There are those sort of big policy questions. We talked about M&S earlier, but there are those policy questions about do you retain or do you replace buildings? So that's featuring very large in what we're doing. But I think in addition to that, the High Street programme that we've already talked about has helped us to think about the kind of the interaction of people and place to a much greater extent. So we're working in some of the sort of outer London boroughs, perhaps more than we have done in the past, to think about the kind of the character of all of London and how we can sort of help to understand what it is that people love about their historic places and how we can sort of build that into their future. Understanding the character of our places, I think, is the kind of the root of everything that we do. Every time we're involved in anything, our recommendation is always understand the place first, understand what it is that is special about it, and build from there rather than sort of assuming a solution before you've done that kind of groundwork. And I think what we're getting much better at is building into that what local people value about their places as well, and I think that's a really important part of what we do, understanding what people cherish about their places and thinking about how that can be built into the future of those communities. You mentioned the City of London, the City of Westminster as well. They're both developing this sort of retrofit first type policies, which is really interesting and innovative. I would say there are a number of other local authorities thinking about that as well, and are being influenced by the direction of travel of both of those cities. We're also seeing some interesting policy developments in places like Kensington and Chelsea, who have just developed what's called a local listed building consent order for solar panels and double glazing in particular circumstances, and we're in favour of that kind of policy context, which really makes clear to local residents what they can do to their buildings, whether they're listed or not, to improve their energy efficiency and do so in a way that sort of reinforces historic character. So we're seeing a lot of policy development which we are really supportive of. We've just done a really interesting piece of research on retrofit skills in collaboration with Grosvenor and Crown Estates, Peabody Estate and the National Trust, so sort of big players in the heritage sector. We've done a bit of extensive research with them on the skills deficit for retrofit, and actually we've got an amazing interactive map on our website I'd encourage you to look at, where you can sort of drill down to specific parts of the country to find out what the skills needs or skills shortages, I suppose, are in each area. It also gives you a kind of a financial figure, the contribution that work would make to the UK economy. So for London as a whole, it says that the research says that we will need 16,000 new jobs across the retrofit sphere in London alone, and that will contribute annually £3 billion to the economy. So that is then sort of itemised, so you can see, as you'd expect, skills like electricians, plumbers, we will find those difficult to pin down, but it sort of itemises how many of each of those are required and sort of breaks it down by skills. So that piece of research, I think, is a really interesting and really sort of powerful way of making the case that this isn't just about the kind of technical needs of the historic environment, but there is also a skills shortage, and we really need to think about how we can develop those skills in a way that will be sympathetic to historic buildings while giving them the life that they so need. It's difficult, and I think requires a sort of range of different solutions. The key one that we are investing in is apprenticeships, in particular traditional skills, the use of lime mortar, etc. We're working very closely with other partners across the sector, some of whom have been doing this for years. SPAB, for example, have their scholars programme, but we're helping to kind of build up those apprenticeship programmes across the country which develop the range of skills that are required to retrofit the historic environment, combined with the research and the technical publications that we're providing to help kind of train people up to understand the best approaches in each case. We've talked a lot about sort of retaining historic buildings and retrofitting them. We're also really interested in how you piece new bits of townscape into historic places, and you do that in a way that reinforces character but is also sustainable. And Peter, I was at your NLA Awards ceremony, what was it, November or so last year, which I really enjoyed, by the way, and I was sitting next to Dave Lomax, who's working on the architect for the black and white building, which seemed to win a number of awards, and rightly so. I followed that up with a visit with him last week, and I was really interested to see the kind of approach to new technologies using traditional materials. And although that's a new building, it's one that sits very comfortably in its surroundings, relates very well to its context, but I think is technically very interesting as well. And I quizzed Dave, as you would expect me to do, about how the transferability of those technologies to retrofit of historic buildings, and he seems really positive about that, and indeed is working on projects of that kind. So we're also interested in innovation, particularly in historic places. How can you extend the life and give vitality to historic places through new development as well as retention of existing buildings?